Hört. Festivals mit Ö1. Heute die Ars Electronica 2024.
Welcome to the Ö1 Festival podcast on the Ars Electronica 2024. The Linz Festival for Art, Technology and Society, taking place from September 4th to 8th, will also be showcasing the award-winning projects of the first S+T+ARTS Prize Africa, among others. With the S+T+ARTS initiative, the European Commission aims to promote innovation at the intersection of science, art and technology. One part of this is the S+T+ARTS Prize, which Ars Electronica organises and hosts as a leading partner. This year, the S+T+ARTS Prize Africa was announced for the first time. 1 grand prize and 5 awards of distinction go to projects that contribute to positive development and digital transformation within the creative sector in Africa. For this 6th edition of our podcast, Hannah Balba spoke to 2 South African artists, Russel Hlongwane and Amy Louise Wilson. Together with their colleague Francois Knoetze, they received an award of distinction for their artistic research project Zata, the Institute of Technological Consciousness. The work takes the form of video, a creative critical text, sculptural masks, costumes and devices, and a series of workshops for young people. From the perspective of a fictional institute and its archive, the artists explore centuries-old technological practices from across the African continent.
I'm pleased to welcome Russel Hlongwane and Amy Louise Wilson from South Africa. Their project Zata, the Institute of Technological Consciousness, receives a S+T+ARTS Prize Africa Award of Distinction. How do you feel receiving that award?
It's a good feeling, of course. I think the takeaway is the fact that the work resonates with audiences. It's the fact that there's a recognition for the importance of the questions we're trying to undertake in the project. So it's really good to be reassured in this way. It's exciting.
Before we talk more in detail about Zata and your inspirations, your research, I would like to get to know you both a little bit better. So how would you describe what you do for a living?
Okay, sure. So the Low Def Film Factory is me, Amy, and Francois Knoetze. We're an artist duo based in Cape Town, South Africa. We work across a lot of different mediums, from archival research to dramaturgy, video art, collage, sculptural installation, new media. And basically what we're doing is asking questions about how technology operates in the global south and more specifically in the South African context. So we do creative research projects often with young people. Sometimes our work takes the form of formal formats like installations, and other times it's workshops. And often we're working in a very kind of participatory DIY way, where we use discarded materials, found materials, low budget. As our name suggests, low def stands for low definition. And so it's not about high production value, it's about kind of the transmission of stories. And although it's DIY and it's low def, we also work with a lot of digital technologies and new media. But the question that we're asking is, how do we make technology make sense in a South African context? And how are people in our context making sense of technology?
How did that project start out? Or when did you realize that you wanted to be an artist or work in that field?
Francois and I have been working together in an informal capacity for more than a decade. And so my background is in theatre and performance and writing and research, and Francois' background is in sculpture and video art. And we've always collaborated on each other's projects. We just formalized the arrangement to work as an artist duo in 2019. And since then, we've realized that we can work more powerfully together and we can bring these different approaches of kind of the embodied approach and the focus on video and digital together to make the work kind of more interesting and more dynamic.
Mm. And Russel, you're a cultural producer. So what does that mean exactly, or what is it that you do?
It's a good term for me to collapse a bunch of interests. So I'm not an artist in the sense that I don't like make, so I don't paint, I don't hold a camera, don't have a formal kind of training in that world. And so the place that I often occupy is one of kind of hatching an idea and inviting practitioners and makers to kind of come together and a kind of orchestration.
You say that your work obsesses over the tensions in modernity, culture, tradition, as it applies to Black life. Is that something you've always kind of been interested in, or how has your journey been to the place where you are now?
I've always had a fascination, or I've always obsessed over a meaning making of what is life and what am I to do with the things that I'm born with. And I'll kind of explain what I mean there. So my family background is that my grandmother was the first to come into the city. I came to being in the very late years of apartheid and the early years of South Africa's democracy. And there's a lot that was changing at that moment. It still is. And some of these questions I don't think can be answered through a kind of peripheral engagement. I think they have to be encountered head on. And so when I left school, I went into the shipping world. I worked in the shipping industry for about 7 years, and I kind of still had these, curiosities and obsessions. So I often say that hip hop is my art school, so because through hip hop, I started to get the answer. I started to get responses to the questions that I had. I was an MC for a few years. I used to rap, and I felt at some point that to play with words was not enough. I needed more in my arsenal to construct the worlds that I wanted to inhabit and exist and think with. And it's from that kind of position, a kind of a dissatisfaction with what was possible through my own voice as a hip-hop artist. Then I ventured into art making in a more like kind of fully fledged and exploded way. So I resigned from the shipping industry after 7 years and I undertook art making full time.
How did the two of you meet?
You mean Knoetze and Russel?
Yes, or the three of you, to say.
We met actually during lockdown. We were part of the same exhibition, University of African Futures in France at Le Unique in Nantes. And we were trapped in a hotel together in lockdown in France, installing this exhibition. And so we formed this relationship and we've admired each other's work from afar for many years. And we said to each other during this period, we really need to work together. We need to find an opportunity to work together. And now this is the third year that we've been working together. Zata was our first project, our first ever collaboration. And each year we just find ways to develop the work, to take it in further directions. And we always saw our collaboration as something that would not just be a once-off instance. And we're happy that it's continued.
Zata, the Institute of Technological Consciousness, is the name of the fictional research institute that became the focal point of Russel Hlongwane, Amy Louise Wilson, and Francois Knoetze's artistic exploration of indigenous technological knowledge. Zata offers an alternative view of Africa's technological history by presenting Africa not only as a recipient of technology, but as a fertile ground for scientific innovation and invention. The centerpiece of the interdisciplinary project is a short film that can be viewed online. It shows an imaginary universe in which the scientists of the Dzata Institute have been traveling across the continent for hundreds of years and working with mobile laboratories.
Prepare to enter the Institute. Begin your initiation into the domains of ancestral handwork.
The project is based on the work of Clapperton Chakanetsa Mavhunga, a professor of science, technology and society at MIT in Boston. Zata takes up Mavhunga's concept of a mobile laboratory embodying the historical practice of African transcendentalists who travelled from kingdom to kingdom to gather knowledge. The name Zata refers to the Zata ruins in the north of South Africa, the remains of an ancient kingdom. These ruins are known for their unusual stone construction and are considered a testament to indigenous innovation.
we fell in love with this idea of a mobile laboratory, that a laboratory can be a crop field, it can be a river, it can be a dream state, that it's not a fixed site. And we expanded it to create this idea of the fictional institute of these scientists who have been moving across the continent for hundreds of years and working with the materials that they find, with the technologies, with the practices of each place that they're in, and building up this kind of a growing, mutating, migrating archive across different parts of the continent. But it's really a way to speak about the position of Africans as not just end users or recipients of ideas around technology, but as originators of so many of these ideas and as active players in this field of technology, not just like passive end users and recipients.
Zata is a very multi-layered project. There is an 8-minute short film, which is packed with images and ideas and kind of almost feels like an experimental sci-fi film in a way. There is a website that you've created, which is detailing the work of the Fictional Institute. There are tons of pictures of sculptures and costumes and props and so forth. How do all of these elements kind of work together, and what story do they tell?
I mean, you're right. This is a really big project, and it's a project that takes so many different forms. And it taking all of these different forms was our way of reaching into different avenues with the research and saying, how can we manifest these ideas? How can we manifest them in visually interesting ways? How can we build up a really full archive that is accessible? Always our aim with showing this work was that audiences could engage in the work, not just as a finished product, but that audiences could also be a part of the building of the work. And that's where the idea for the workshops came from, because we did a couple of workshops with young people, which were about positioning young people as technological innovators. And so we would arrive in a space with many different materials, a lot of e-waste, old computers, mouses, but also other materials from wherever we were. And young people were tasked with firstly identifying challenges in their community that they felt were urgent, that needed solving. And secondly, with inventing some kind of a prototype or device that would be able to address this issue. But the idea was not necessarily to create devices that, you know, could work and could go into the market, but also just to create a space for play.
Could you name maybe some examples, what they came up with?
Yeah, there's so many amazing examples. One of the workshops that we did in Cape Town, one of the devices that stood out, and this child must have been 10 who made this device. They called it a violence de-escalation device. It's a self-operated vehicle that moves around and automatically detects like an incident of violence that happens. And when it does so, it shines a really bright light on the incident, and it projects like calming and soothing sentences to kind of de-escalate the violence. And so that's just like one amazing example of a child identifying a really clear and obvious issue in their community and trying to find a way to resolve it.
It's part science fiction, part reality, part actual people and costumes, and part artificial intelligence, right? So how did you incorporate those technologies into your creative process?
The real life part of it is research that came from looking at instances of vernacular technological use on the continent. We worked with quite a range of South African actors and performers and voiceover artists to do these very experimental performances, often on green screen, but we did some location shoots as well. Of course, Russel is the head scientist in the film, so you see him performing in many scenes. And then the AI, it was kind of just the time when AI image generation was newly accessible to us. And so we were playing around a lot with that. And the idea and the motivation behind that was often this archive of technological practices on the African continent is oral. And so there is not that much evidence of it in written form. It's hard to find examples of it, which is why Chakanetsa's book is so important because he's done field work and field research to understand how indigenous knowledge has operated on the continent for a long time. But in the absence of having archives that we could draw from, we went into the speculative place and we kind of asked ourselves, like, how can we use AI to build up our own fictional archive of this institute with varying results, really.
Can you share some examples of indigenous technological knowledge or practice that you portray that you found particularly fascinating?
Yeah, there are a few. Maybe one that I can bring here in the film. We make mention of a spiritual electric charged entity called Umuntu. Umuntu is a figure, an entity, say, within Nguni folklore. And this entity is said to be comprised of spirit matter and electric charge. It helps us ask the question of how is it that people could conjure this entity? What are the technical processes and what is the technical knowledge that is required to manipulate spiritual energy and electric charge? If there's an electric charge in this entity, is there to say that there was some kind of electricity generation or a manipulation of lights that comes from this part of the world prior to Edison, for example, or Tesla, for example? And so what is a cosmology that holds that together? What is that knowledge system?
I think that one other example that I could give, Hannah, which I found so captivating, is the tsetse fly, which some people might know as the fly that gives sleeping sickness. And in Mavhunga's research, he writes about the tsetse fly and Zimbabwean people's knowledge of how to combat the tsetse fly as a way to speak about how indigenous technological knowledge was co-opted by colonial powers and co-opted into like official policy controls, pest control methods, basically, and some of which might seem very simple, but it's a way to speak about how local knowledge was like co-opted into Western science and eventually translated into official science and policy. And he uses this idea of the methods that were used to control the tsetse fly to show how technological knowledge is part of a very long chain of accumulated knowledge, that it's not just like some thing that just miraculously happens. He calls it a Houdini Act of white people, that it's not just a thing of a single inventor, like, okay, now this technology exists in the world and here it is and it's miraculous and it's amazing and you can't understand the complexity of how it was made. But if we are to like reject that idea of technological innovation, we can start to see Africa as a place where knowledge was accumulated over a long period of time and part of this like longer chain. So that's what we mean when we talk about like rejecting kind of these official understandings of how technology and technological innovation happens.
I would like to go back to the Ars Electronica Festival, which will be dedicated to the theme Hope this year. And I was wondering, what brings you to hope these days?
It's to constantly look for these new worlds that have been suppressed, these worlds that have been underexposed, and to constantly be surprised at what jumps out at you. I think for people of the South, the archive is often a very violent place. Alongside that, there are these other archives that are not in the form of official documents that, for me, as I constantly engage with them, I'm constantly surprised that there are these messages in there, there are these gems that help us confront and make sense of troubled times. And so this is a place that I often go for. So in the context of, say, this film, for example, we've worked with multiple forms of archival and preservation methods. And out of that, there's a kind of resurfacing of a way of posturing and thinking about materiality and society in ways that are much healthier in a kind of markets-driven, capitalistic world, that determines how humans should engage with materiality and objects, And so there are many other ways that we can coexist with other forms of life, ones that are a bit more grounded, less tension. This is where I go for hope.
We've been working with some heavy subject matter for the last couple of years around technology and extraction. And so this project actually opened up a space of hope for us because it allowed us to move a little bit away from that and more into a space of play and into the joy of discovering new parts of the archive, but also inventing them. And as Russel said, bringing these archival silences to light can be really freeing. It can be really joyful. It can be a really powerful tool, excising kind of stuff that's been lost from the record of history, or rather recovering things that have been lost from the record of history.
That was Amy Louise Wilson and Russel Hlongwane in the U1 Festival Guide to Ars Electronica 2024. Thank you very much for listening. In the next episode, Hanna Balber talks to entrepreneur Agnes Eisleitner. Born in Upper Austria, she has set up companies in Jordan, Ukraine and Uganda and invests in early-stage African fintech startups with her venture capital firm First Circle Capital. At the Ars Electronica Festival, she'll be taking part in the STARTS Day conference titled Alternatives, Digital Technologies for New Economic Models.